Hi there, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Karen Fabian, and I'm so glad you're here. I know you've got limited time, so thanks for spending some of it with me. Whether you're a brand new yoga teacher, currently in training, or you've been teaching for years, this podcast is for you. My goal is to help you feel like teaching can be easy, fun, and a natural extension of who you are, rather than something you have to do the right way, whatever that is, or something that feels like you have to work hard at it all the time. This isn't a podcast where I'll be telling you what to do or critiquing your teaching. Instead, I'll share frameworks, skills, and techniques you can experiment with to see what works for you, especially when it comes to understanding anatomy, cueing, and sequencing. I'll share ideas that may challenge what you believe about what it takes to be a yoga teacher. All I ask is that you keep an open mind, because some of what I share may sound different from what you've heard. We'll also talk about the mindset of a confident teacher, not only because it's such a big part of empowered teaching, but because it's rarely discussed. With that, welcome, and let's get into today's conversation. Hi there. Welcome to Conversations for Yoga Teachers. I'm your host, Karen Fabian, and this is episode 399. Oh my God, almost at 400 episodes. I'm just blown away. So I'm recording this on April 10th, 2026, and this will go live on April 14th or April 13th. And I just want to say, people are listening to this podcast. I checked my podcast stats like I always do on Sunday or Monday. And over the past week, I had triple the amount of downloads. I usually have, I don't know, something like 400 a week. And when I logged in on Sunday to my podcast dashboard, it was over 1,000. So, and a big spike on Mondays, which is when the episodes go live. So if you've been listening to the show, I just want to say thank you so much. And I'm just so glad that we have this time once a week to get together. And even though it's sort of one-sided, I'm speaking out into the void. I do check the stats. It doesn't say anything about who's listening. It just says where in the world they are. There's obviously a lot of people that listen who live in the United States, as I do, but there's a lot of people that live outside the US that listen as well. So anything you want to share, or if you ever want to reach out and just let me know you're a listener, I would love that. You can send me a DM on Instagram. I do oftentimes, in talking to a teacher, they'll say, "Oh, I really like your podcast," or "I've been listening to your podcast," or "Something you said resonated with me." And I absolutely love that. Matter of fact, today I end this episode with a couple of inquiry questions that, if you're inspired to send me a quick note and let me know what came up for you, I would love to hear it. So today's episode, we're going to try to stick to this 20-minute format that I've been doing this year, 2026. And we're going to talk about balancing poses. This is going to be the second in my series on themes for your classes. 2 weeks ago, I did an episode on yoga for mental health, and that episode is live along with a companion practice video. I decided to make a companion practice video for each one of these episodes where I'm talking about themes for your classes, so you can get some ideas for sequencing your classes on your end and use these episodes and the companion video maybe as a little bit of inspiration to do that. Now, I do want to mention one additional thing that relates to kind of getting inspiration for your classes. I just this week updated the Bare Bones Yoga Practice Portal, which is a program that I had back in the pandemic. I had created it during the pandemic because obviously nobody was practicing in yoga studios. And I created an online library of recorded yoga classes, almost, I don't know, 60 sequences. And I chunked them out into general sequences, specialty sequences, sequences for athletes of different kinds, and then guided meditations. So it is a literal library of sequences. Now, after the pandemic, I sort of I don't want to say, not grandfathered, I sort of backburnered that because I was supporting teachers primarily in my one-on-one program, which is the Blueprint Learning Program. And most recently, over the past year and a half, my focused, shorter program, the Yoga Anatomy Accelerator. But a couple of weeks ago, somebody said to me, "Do you have anything that's like a library of sequences?" And I thought, yes, I do. So over the past week, I've updated the Bare Bones Yoga Practice portal. It's just $99. And even though it's not on my website, it is something that I can send you the link for. I'll most likely add the link to my social media. If you look at my profile on social media, there is a link right there that takes you to some of my free ebooks and some of my free downloads. I'll probably put it there. But if you would like to check this out, it's really short money, like I said, 99 bucks, and you might find some really interesting sequencing in here that you can leverage for your own classes. The other aspect of it, though, is of course you can practice to it. So I'll just leave that as a thought maybe in your mind. It's the Bare Bones Yoga Practice portal. If you want the link for it, you can even just send me a direct message and I'll send it to you. So today we'll talk about sequencing for balance. And one other thing, I am going to include the link to the YouTube video for the Yoga for Mental Health episode in the show notes. So just to let you know, if you missed that, the link will be right in the show notes. Now, for today, because we're talking about balances, we're going to talk about definitely standing balances. We'll also talk about arm balances. And then we'll also talk about some variations of poses you can do to emphasize balance, which is a little bit of a different thing than just teaching a balancing pose. It's kind of adding some variations to things that might be more stationary to add the balance challenge. And then I'm also going to talk about dynamic movements. You know, even though in a dynamic movement, your feet might not leave the floor or one foot might not leave the floor, because it is dynamic, so think about if you have people facing sideways on the mat, like a straddle forward fold, and you add some dynamic movement side to side. There is a balance component to that to keep the body's center of gravity stable so the person doesn't fall forward or fall back. So dynamic movements are another way to improve balance and to work on balance, even though you're not literally picking one foot up off the ground. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So let's talk about what are some of the benefits of balance. And I love to talk about benefits because I feel like oftentimes teachers are caught up in obviously teaching the pose, giving the cues, and they miss an opportunity to share the benefit. I mean, if you look at our entire social media feed, especially when it comes to health and wellness content like yoga, it's all about presenting benefits to get clicks, to read articles. Sometimes they focus on the negative, the dangers of not doing something or doing something in an incorrect way. But if you focus on the benefits, it's such a great way, of course, for us as yoga teachers to emphasize to the people in your class, here's the benefit of what we're doing right now. Here's the benefit on your body. And that can really spark interest in your students. It can increase your class retention because people will come back to your class because they realize they're getting this additional piece that maybe they're not getting from somebody else. They're not hearing from other teachers. What's the benefit of what we're actually doing here? And this gives you a chance to demonstrate your knowledge. This gives you a chance to apply your knowledge to actual teaching by speaking to the benefits of what you're teaching them. So when we look at the benefits of balance, one of the things that happens is we are asking students to integrate their muscles. This is more commonly known as muscle integration. And what that means is it speaks to the coordinated effort of a group of muscles at the same time to, in this case, create stability, even when you're balancing. And the ability to integrate muscles in the act of doing a yoga pose, again, let's say a balancing posture, is a demonstration of efficiency in the body. It's a demonstration of the coordinated effort between the nervous system and the musculoskeletal system. And so, without getting too into the science, it is part of not just developing strength, but developing awareness and students activating muscles collectively, many muscles collectively to do a pose. One really basic example, which isn't a balancing posture, but it is an example of integration, is plank pose. When you have someone in plank, that is a demonstration of muscular integration. They're integrating the concentric action, or really, I should say, the isometric action, because the muscle length isn't changing. It's a posture where they are steady, where they are stable, where there isn't dynamic movement. So if you're holding somebody in plank for 10 seconds, they're using shoulder stabilizers. They're using core musculature. They're using leg musculature, right? There's a number of different muscular groups, spine musculature, to maintain the pose. So that's a really good example, even standing in Tadasana, quite frankly, a good example of muscular integration, and that is part of balance. Another benefit, and this is definitely something you can speak to if you're comfortable speaking to the anatomy, is improvement of hip strength. When we have someone stand on one leg, let's say in tree pose, they depend on hip musculature to keep the pelvis level or to keep the pelvis steady when they're in the pose. Later in this episode, I'll mention some of the names of the muscles, but I want you to just now think about increasing hip strength. If you ever watch somebody running, let's say you're driving down the street and you see a runner, watch their hip positioning. If you see a lot of hip movement, that's a sign that oftentimes hip musculature is not strong enough, is weak. And as a result, the pelvis has a lot of play. There's a lot of movement in the pelvis. And if you're running, you don't want a lot of excess movement anywhere. You want the body to be very aerodynamic. One of the muscle groups that tends to get weak over time is the lateral hip stabilizers, and we'll talk a little bit about those in a few minutes. One of the other things that's a benefit of balance, which is so important, is improving ankle strength. There's a number of muscles that surround the ankle joint. The ankle joint is a joint that is susceptible to strains and sprains. And oftentimes these things happen not in, I mean, I would say generally not in yoga class, but more just in activities of daily living, stepping out of the car, stepping off a curb, walking in bad weather where it's slippery or whatever the conditions are, walking on uneven surfaces. I mean, I can certainly remember when Ben's dad was alive, there was a point where he was so unsteady that it was really challenging for him to walk when we would go to the golf club or when we would be someplace where it was a gravel surface or a stone surface. You know, obviously, as people age, their risk of trips and falls increases. And I don't know if you've ever heard this, but from an aging perspective, one of the highest risks for increased mortality is connected to hip fractures. And this speaks to the importance of increasing and improving and continuing to work on balance as people get older to prevent slips and falls. And that, of course, is also connected to as we age, there are problems with bone density, especially in women, because density of bone is connected to estrogen, and estrogen drops as we age. So we'll get into a little bit of that in a few moments, but it all points to the importance of balance. And so here we're talking about ankle strength. We're talking about one of the benefits. Let's say you have people in airplane pose or tree pose or dancer's pose. They are depending on, in part, muscles that surround the ankle joint to improve ankle stability. Another important benefit of balancing postures is improved proprioception. Proprioception is a function of the nervous system. It's your ability to be aware of your body in space, be aware of your limbs in space. It's dependent on not transmitters, but receptors that you have in your skin, in your fascia, in your muscles that communicate with your brain and spinal cord and develop awareness or almost like report back to the brain, like, where is my arm? The arm that I can't see. Now, obviously, if there's any kind of degenerative disease or neuromuscular disease, this is the kind of thing that's affected. But again, and I keep saying as people age, but it's not even necessarily as people age. It is an important skill for anyone, regardless of age, to have good proprioception. Good proprioception is what allows us to, let's say, if you go for a run and you trip suddenly, it allows you in part to right yourself so you're not going to fall on your face. So that's just one example. Another benefit of balancing postures is that it increases coordination. Coordination also relates to the first thing I shared about muscular integration. Coordination can also be, if you want to go a little bit deeper into the science, referred to as neuromuscular coordination. So neuro referring to nerve, coordination, muscular, of course, muscle. So nerve and muscle, or nervous system and muscle coordination, because all of our muscles are innervated by motor neurons, which come from the spinal cord. So there is a coordinated effort, a coordinated messaging from the spinal cord to the muscle, and we voluntarily move our muscles. So the better coordination we have, the better coordination that we demonstrate when we do a balancing posture, especially if it's one that comes in the face of a dynamic movement portion of the sequence, the better coordination we build. And this again improves our balance, improves our ability to catch ourselves before we fall, like if we step off that curb or trip when we're going for a run. One of the other things that I talked about a second ago was bone density. And this is definitely a concern for women as we age and get into perimenopause and menopause due to the decrease in estrogen, which affects bone density. Bone density and yoga, there are plenty of articles out there, but just in general, what I want you to think about is that the impact of compressive forces on bone is what stimulates production of bone. And this continues as we age, even though it gets harder as we get older. But one of the best things you can do is put your bones through compressive forces. This is why when you exercise, or even let's just say in a yoga practice, even something really minimal like jumping from down dog to the top of your mat, or doing some kind of variation in the sequence where you have some kind of really moderate jumping, can put bone through compressive forces. But the other place we see this is just in grounding down, rooting down, the action of rooting down, standing up and rooting down. We're going to talk about this when I talk about cues in a few minutes. But I want you to think about when you put bone through that compressive force, it can stimulate the production of new bone. So that is one of the benefits of standing balances. And then we talked about preventing slips and trips. That's another benefit that comes. One of the other things is improving joint stability. If you've ever heard things like stack your joints in a pose. So let's say you're doing tree pose again, and you see someone has an anterior pelvic tilt, meaning the top edge of the pelvis is tilted forward. That means there's not as much stacking of the pelvis over the standing leg. The top edge of the pelvis is now over the standing leg, moving in front of it. So if you ask that person, can you root into your standing leg more and level your pelvis? Now you have better alignment between the standing leg and that side of the pelvis. Another example that's not a balancing pose is if we go back to plank and we have people stack the shoulders over the wrists, or warrior one, stack the front knee over the heel, or let's say standing hand to knee pose, stack the head over the shoulder, over the hip, over the knee, over the ankle of the standing leg. So that's one long line of stability. So this is the illustration of joint stability. And joint stability is a function of not just the muscles that surround the joint, but also the joint itself. And when we bring people into better alignment where there is joint stability, we encourage better joint mechanics. Because if there isn't joint stability, oftentimes that can create problems in the joint from an alignment point of view. Another thing that balancing poses do is they improve functional movement. So what does that actually mean? I want you to think about, people are coming to your classes. They come from all walks of life. They all have different jobs. They all have different levels of movement in their day. But when we look at all of us as humans, we want to have the ability to move our body over time through different terrains, through different movements, through different situations. Now, thousands of years ago, when humans were running around to get their food, doing a lot of stuff outside, being in bare feet, functional movement was a part of their culture. But of course, we know that now that has decreased basically to zero. I mean, I saw a post on social media the other day, and the person was cracking up about somebody had posted a video saying she orders all her food from delivery service. And the person sort of mocking her in this video was saying, "That's so ridiculous. You live in New York City where it's so easy to walk to get all your food." But this is a perfect example of we've become such a sedentary society that we don't have oftentimes, people don't have a lot of just basic functional movement. And when you bring people into your yoga class or when people come to your yoga class, do you find that your sequencing is focused on functional movement or more focused on niche movement? This is one of the problems I have when I go to a yoga class and it's a whole bunch of stuff where people are moving way outside the range of motion that so many people even have access to. It's like, oh, this is kind of a cool pose. I get it, but this isn't really functional movement. This really doesn't mimic anything we're doing in our day-to-day life. So I want you to think of functional movement as a term, as one that describes just healthy movement we need to use, we need to access throughout the day. And when we're doing balancing poses, we're giving people an opportunity to increase their functional movement skill set. We're also giving them a chance to, and this is another benefit, improve the stabilization of their spine and their limbs, right? And this is also integration. When we have somebody stand in hand to knee pose and, root into your left leg, pick up your right leg and reach out and grab your right knee. Now they need to coordinate the isometric contraction of the erector spinae, which keeps the spine erect, as well as the core stabilizers, as well as muscles of the lateral hip. So it's an opportunity to coordinate the stabilization of both spine and limbs. And then, of course, all balancing poses have an ability or have a benefit of improving core musculature, the strength of it, the ability to activate it. I mean, I can remember there was a student in my class years ago, and after class, and I mentioned this on the podcast one time, after class, she said to me, I'm noticing whenever you cue to the core, I don't really feel anything. And we got into this kind of long conversation. She stayed quite a bit after class, and I did some sort of somatic awareness exercises with her. And she started to share a little bit with me about her background, and not really her background, but really her life story. And there was some trauma that she had gone through, and there were surgeries that she had had that were in her abdominal area. And so I was just sharing with her, even just at the level of having multiple surgeries in the abdominal area, the fascia, the muscles, these things are, of course, impacted, and that alone can affect your ability to concentrically contract those muscles, to activate those muscle fibers. So core activation when we have people balance definitely is something that is a benefit. So now that we've talked about the benefits of balancing postures, let's talk a little bit about teaching balancing postures. So one of the just general rules of thumb that I like to share is teaching from the ground up. So certainly in any kind of standing balance, it doesn't make much sense to look at people from the waist up if they're out of alignment. Start at the ground and correct through your cueing whatever is misaligned at the ground, and that will translate up. Now you can teach top down, but I find it's just easier to kind of fix what's not working at the bottom, and that affects the top. I want you to remember that the body works as a kinetic chain. And the kinetic chain concept basically speaks to how the body is an integrated system. And, from an exercise science point of view, it's called the human movement system, HMS. And this descriptor basically reflects that if something's out of alignment in one part of the body, it affects other things, quote unquote, in the chain. So this is another way to think about teaching from the ground up. Alignment of joints, we've talked a lot about that already. So making sure that whatever is baked into the pose in terms of the alignment, you're looking for that in the students. The idea of cueing them to integrate their core, right? So giving cues that integrate, give them an opportunity to activate, integrate, and feel their core musculature. So when you're teaching balancing poses, it's not just about teaching to the standing leg, it's also about giving people cues to the core to help them bring that in from a contribution, a muscular contribution standpoint. And then teaching balancing poses also gives us a chance to speak to activation of the hip muscles. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a second in terms of actual muscles, but think about, again, when you have somebody in tree, if you see pelvic misalignment, one side is lower than the other, which is called drop hip and is super common. And similar to the running example I gave before, it's a sign of weak lateral hip stabilizers like the glute med and the glute min. So cueing to activating those lateral hip muscles can be a really great way to build people's awareness of them, to help them get to know what they're called, and to help them strengthen those muscles as well. So the muscles we're talking about, certainly in the standing leg, we're talking about the quadriceps. The quadriceps is the muscle in the thigh, the front of the thigh, that is responsible for knee extension. There are four heads to the quads, the vastus medialis, intermedius, and lateralis, and then there's the rectus femoris, which not only straightens the knee, it also crosses the hip and is a hip flexor. Now, cueing to the quads is really helpful for any standing balance because it is the muscle of knee extension. So if you have a pose where there's a standing straight leg, you want to cue to that. One thing I will say, sometimes people cue things around like lifting the kneecap. I don't necessarily think you need to do that. And I'm not always sure that people are really sure of why they're doing that. It's oftentimes a cue that teachers pick up from other teachers. I think the rationale for speaking to the kneecap comes from, and this is what I would say if I were to use a cue like that. I would be willing to bet $1 million. A lot of teachers that use this cue aren't 100% sure why they use it. But I'm going to tell you, and this is oftentimes like when people ask me to interpret cues, I can't get into the head of the teacher that said it. So I have to make a guess based on my understanding of anatomy as to why someone would use a cue like this. So if I do that with that cue, what I would say is all of the heads of the quads converge on the knee via the patellar tendon. And the patellar tendon is the insertion into the patella of the four heads of the quads. So if you're asking someone in a standing balance to lift the kneecap, you're basically asking them to focus on the insertion of the quads on the patella. But in my mind, the reason that's not really a helpful cue is you're speaking to the end point of the muscle rather than the belly of the muscle. And the belly of the muscle is really in the middle of the thigh. So, in my view, a more effective cue is to ask people engage the muscle in your thigh, squeeze the muscle in your thigh, activate your quads by squeezing your thigh. Because now you're not talking to the end point of the muscle, you're talking to the belly of the muscle where there's more power, there's more muscle fiber. So that would be my statement on that. The lateral hip stabilizers are the gluteus medius and the gluteus minimus. This is not the glutes, it's part of the glutes. The other part of the glutes is the gluteus maximus, which is on the posterior aspect of the hip and is responsible for hip extension. Here, we're not talking about hip extension because in a lot of balancing poses, the hips are level, or maybe in something like dancer's pose, there's an anterior tip. But we're talking more about the lateral hip stabilizers, glute med and glute min, to keep the pelvis level and to prevent hip drop. So, like in tree pose, to prevent one hip from dropping lower than the other. The core muscle we're talking about is not necessarily internal or external obliques, which are responsible for twisting and side bending. And it's to a certain extent not really the rectus abdominis, which is really more responsible for spinal flexion. It's really the transversus abdominis, which is a pretty big muscle that wraps around the center of the body. And if you cue people in tree pose to hug the sides of the waist in, that's going to get you activation of the transversus abdominis. And then the other group of muscles that I think we often forget about are the intrinsic foot stabilizers. When you ask someone in dancer's pose, let's say, to spread the toes and to lift the inner arch of the standing foot, to root down into your feet, to root down and spread out through your toes, you're asking them to activate a whole number of muscles that are on the plantar surface of the foot, the bottom of the foot. So these are muscles like the hallucis longus, I won't go into all the details. Just know that there's a number of muscles that are on the bottom of the foot. Now, one other thing I want to say about the plantar surface of the foot, and I've actually done this in some classes and workshops, and it's been pretty transformative for people, is we'll do a little MFR rolling, myofascial release rolling with an MFR ball in a standing position. So we'll just have people standing in, I'll just have people stand in Tadasana, take the MFR ball, roll the bottom of the foot, do the other side, and then come into some balances. And essentially what that focuses on is the thick band of fascia at the bottom of the foot. So you've got the plantar fascia, which is a thick band of fascia, which is connective tissue, not muscle. But because it's on the bottom of the foot, because it's a pretty thick band of connective tissue, it is susceptible to scarring, to muscle fiber breakage, not muscle fiber, sorry, collagen fiber breakage, because it's not muscle. So it's doesn't have muscle fibers, it's got collagen fibers. And sort of knots in the fibers. And so when you use an MFR ball, you're smoothing things out, you're breaking up those adhesions. And doing work like that before standing balances can be really helpful for people to bring greater awareness to their feet and to start to get some of that internal, I guess I would say, disintegrity cleared up in the fascia before you do the balance. So I just wanted to add that in as well. So in terms of cueing balancing poses, things that I'll just throw out that you can experiment with in your classes, things like rooting down into the standing foot, the standing leg, hug in, hug the sides of the waist in for the transversus abdominis, hug the sides of the hips in for the lateral hip stabilizer activation, press down, right? So press down into your standing leg, root down and lift up through the crown, which refers to axial extension. So axial extension is the act of extending the spine, but not in spinal extension of a back bend, in standing extension. So just like in Tadasana, if you were to ask people in Tadasana to root into your feet and draw up through the crown of your head, you're asking them to do axial extension, which is, again, back to compressive forces, a great way to hopefully, even on a small level, impact bone density. Now, in terms of actual postures, obviously, I'm sure you know some of these balancing poses, but things like tree and dancers, eagle, standing hand to knee, even crescent lunge, I consider a balance because the back heel is up. Half moon, something like taking people from crescent lunge, and instead of taking them through a vinyasa, having them go from crescent lunge to stepping to the top of the mat and then stepping the other foot back. So this is a dynamic movement where you're asking them to bring that back foot where the heel is up, step it to the top of the mat, and that's a chance to get into some of that coordinated strength, that neuromuscular coordination we talked about at the beginning. The other thing I really like to do, and I'll put this in the video that goes with this episode, which will be posted a couple of days after this episode goes live, is I like to take people from airplane down into standing split and then up into standing, but keep the leg up, kick the leg forward, and then drop the foot down, and then do it on the other side. That's a nice example of bringing some dynamic movement to an otherwise pretty steady balance. Now, that's considered a progression. So you wouldn't want to do that straight away. You'd want to start people with just basic airplane and then take them from airplane, hands on the ground, kick up, standing split, and then come back up, both feet flat, sweep the arms up, hands to heart center. Do the other side. And then you can progress from there, adding a little more challenge by taking them from airplane to standing split. But then when they come up from standing split, don't let that foot touch the ground. Kick the leg forward and then bring the foot down. So you're progressing them through this balancing sequence, adding the combination of the balancing pose with the dynamic movement. This is a great way to improve their proprioception, their neuromuscular coordination, the integration of all the muscles that are involved isometrically to keep their balance. All right, so as we come to the end of this episode, I want to ask you a couple of questions and just see if something comes forth in your mind. And I would love for you to send me a DM on Instagram and let me know what came up. So the first thought or first question I have for you is, what's one thing you learned today? What's one new thing? What's one new term? What's one new concept that you learned today in this episode? And then the second thing is there something you heard today that you would be interested to try in your classes? So I'd love to know your answers to those questions, so you can just hopefully send me a DM on IG. Now, I want to remind you that the show notes is going to have a link to the podcast, which was the first theme I covered, Yoga for Mental Health, as well as the link to the companion practice video that lives on my YouTube channel. And then I'm also going to include, I don't know if you ever got a copy of my ebook called From the Interview Chair, where I have a number of just snippets of topics I talked about when I was interviewed last year on a whole bunch of different yoga related podcasts, and along with a little snippet from the episode that I wrote out. I have a link to the episode if you're intrigued when you read it and the little snippet and you want to listen to the actual interview, you can go ahead and do that. Now, before we wrap up today, don't go anywhere yet, because I want to just end this conversation with one more thing. I've had a couple of people, actually more than a couple of people over the past few weeks, reach out to me because they're having some problems with their teaching, not sure with their cues, not understanding anatomy, feeling like they want to walk around more and they're not really sure how to do that, not feeling really confident, whatever the problem is, right? And so I get these kinds of emails or DMs on Instagram, and, I start out, talk to the person, maybe we get on a Zoom call, talk a little bit about how I can help them. And over the past couple of weeks, what I've noticed is a number of teachers, after I've talked to them, have counted themselves out from working with me because they've basically said, I'm not ready. And the not ready reason falls into a couple different categories. I've had actually a couple of teachers reach out to me who haven't actually started their 200-hour training yet, but they're anticipating the anatomy part is going to be a little hard for them to understand. And they're watching my videos on social and they're seeing I talk a lot about the anatomy, and that's inspiring them to connect with me. And then we talk a little bit about the program. And I'm hearing from that type of teacher or teacher to be, I don't know that I'm ready to work with you because I don't really understand anatomy yet, right? So that's one type. The other type, though, is someone who is saying, and this is a different situation, I'm not teaching right now. You know what? Maybe I was teaching at one point, but I stopped for whatever reason. I'm not teaching right now. So I don't want to, spend time in your program right now working with you because I don't feel like it's really going to benefit me because I'm not teaching right now. And then there's other people who say, I don't think I know enough to work with you. All right, so I want to just generally speak to this because if you're listening right now and you want to get help, there are some things that are not clicking for you when you're teaching, or you're in one of those other situations, like maybe you're in a 200-hour teacher training right now and you're already realizing that the anatomy portion isn't really helping you understand it and how to apply it to your teaching. So whatever in your head has you counting yourself out. That's why I wanted to hop on here and speak to this, because I don't want you to count yourself out. And it has nothing to do with me wanting to make money and me wanting to sell you a program. I never ever think of me as selling a program. That never comes into my head because it's not about that. For me, it's about helping you be the best teacher you want to be. That's the only thing it's about. And getting you out there teaching in a way where it feels easy and fun. Because I know when you're out there teaching like that, you're going to love teaching and you're going to positively impact every single person who comes to your class. So, just really quickly, if you are considering enrolling in my accelerator program and you're not currently in a teacher training, but you're intrigued because you're thinking, man, I would really like to understand anatomy. In my view, it would be the smartest decision ever to be in my program before you take your 200-hour, because then you're going to go into your 200-hour. You're going to be so much more confident with the anatomy piece. You're going to be way ahead of everybody else, and you're going to really be able to enjoy your training, learn from your training, honestly, so much more than everybody else because you won't be scrambling to understand the anatomy. You'll have checked that box already in working with me. So that's number one. Number two, if you're interested in working with me, but you're not currently teaching, either you didn't start or you haven't started yet, or you were teaching and then you stopped teaching, there's nothing that says you need to be actively teaching in order to work with me. All that needs to be there is that you have a desire to improve. You have a desire to fix a problem you're having. And in my mind, if you're not currently teaching, but you want to get back to it, and you've got some problems around the anatomy piece and applying anatomy to your teaching, it would be really smart to get that problem fixed before you start teaching again. So there's that. And then the last kind of person is somebody who feels intimidated, somebody who feels like, well, I don't think I actually know enough to work with you in the program. And there's no better person than someone who has the insight into a lack of knowledge around something. I mean, quite frankly, so many yoga teachers that I talk to think they understand anatomy and they don't. And the reason I know it is because of the things they say to me. And I just gently ask them some questions around what they just said, and it becomes abundantly clear in the questions I'm asking them that they don't understand anatomy. And they'll start to realize it as we're talking, and then they'll say, oh, wow, I guess I don't understand that. So you can literally teach your whole life thinking you know this stuff, and you don't know this stuff. And that's being oblivious. In the learning world, that's what they call unconscious incompetence. You don't even know what you don't know. And unfortunately, the yoga industry creates thousands of teachers like this because there's no test that you have to take to prove that you understand anatomy. There's nobody in your class that's going to stand up and say, sorry, that cue is just not right. Right? No, there's nothing. So you can teach your whole life thinking, I know this, and you don't. It's just, I'm sorry, I'm just being frank with you here. So I would much rather work with someone. It's not really much rather. I think it's great if you have this awareness that there's this learning gap that you have. And that is being ready. That is someone who is ready. So I don't want you to think that you have to clean up, learn anything, button up. There's no prep you need to do other than I want to be a better teacher. I feel inspired to learn this. I want to fix the problems I'm having. I have a sense of urgency around being a better teacher. That's it, you know? So I just wanted to speak to that whole idea of being ready. And I just want to make sure that you are not counting yourself out of the opportunity for us to work together so I can help you be the most confident, empowered teacher you want to be. Don't count yourself out ever. And the best thing you can do is just reach out to me and let's just hop on a quick call and I can find out more about you and let you know how I can help. All right, so that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I look forward to talking to you on the next episode. Namaste. Thanks so much for listening. If this episode got you thinking about a current challenge you're having in your classes or gave you ideas that connect to how you'd like to teach, I'd love to hear from you. I know a lot of teachers try to figure things out on their own by reading books, listening to podcast episodes, geez, even mine, or watching videos on social media. And while those things can be helpful, they don't actually solve the problem. What I've seen in my work with teachers is that problem solving and breakthroughs happen when you reach out for help and get one-on-one support, not in an hours-based program, not in a group training, but in a setting where what's going on with you is the focus. If this sounds like the kind of support that would make a difference for you, send me a message on Instagram at Barebones Yoga or email me at Karen@barebonesyoga.com. Just include the word podcast and tell me what's on your mind, your biggest challenge right now, or something you want to do next but aren't sure how to get started. I'll reply back with a couple of specific things you can try, and if it makes sense, we can hop on a call as well. You don't have to figure it out on your own.